1968, the day they lowered Earl Harding into the ground after 46 years of marriage, someone backed flatbed trucks down Dorothy's farm road and dumped 6 rusted broken tractors along her fence line. Her own son had arranged it, a mechanic's widow with nothing but an old hound dog and a funeral dress still damp with tears. The county gave her weeks to clear the iron or face condemnation. So Dorothy did something nobody in that town expected. She walked to her kitchen, opened the junk drawer, pulled out a set of metric wrenches and went to work. She rebuilt every one of those tractors, and when the last engine turned over, she followed a trail of missing parts to a locked barn her husband had kept secret for 20 years, and what she found inside was something no one in that county had ever seen. Earl Harding died on a Tuesday in March. Heart attack. Right there in the side yard next to the woodpile he had been splitting since November. Dorothy found him face down in the grass with the axe still in his hand and Copper lying beside him, chin resting on Earl's boot. She called the ambulance. But she already knew. She had known this man since she was 22. She knew his breathing when he slept and the set of his shoulders when he was tired. His hands were still. The funeral was on Friday. Small church off the county road, half-empty pews, a pastor who checked his notes twice for Earl's middle name. 14 people came. Dorothy counted them from the front row. She had cooked for this family every holiday, hosted every birthday, driven every child to school and every grandchild to the doctor. 14 was what showed up when Earl left. Bradley arrived 20 minutes into the service. He came through the side door in a charcoal suit that cost more than Earl made in a month of repair work. He sat in the third pew and checked his phone during the eulogy. Linda drove up from Knoxville the night before. She wore black and kept her hands in her lap. When the pastor asked if the family wanted to say a few words, she shook her head. Their youngest son did not come. He sent white lilies from Memphis. The card said, "With deepest sympathy," in a florist's handwriting. After the burial, Dorothy stood at the edge of the grave while the groundskeeper waited with his backhoe 20 yards back. She put her hand flat on the casket and held it there. Then she straightened up and walked to the car. The reception was at the farmhouse. Hank Jessup brought a casserole his late wife had taught him to make. A woman from the church brought corn muffins and foil. 2 men from the feed co-op stood in the kitchen drinking coffee from Earl's mugs and not knowing what to say. Bradley found Dorothy in the hallway. She was carrying a plate of sandwiches she had made at 5 that morning because she did not know what else to do with her hands. "Mom, we should talk about the property." She stopped walking. "Your father has been in the ground for 3 hours, Bradley." "I know. I'm sorry about the timing, but there's a development group looking at parcels out here, and they have a deadline at the end of the month. Real money, Mom. I just need you to think about it. I have lived on this land for 46 years. That's exactly my point. It is too much for one person now. The house needs a new roof. The fences are rotting. The equipment barn is leaning. And Dad left you what, $1,200? $1,140? Mom, I am not selling this farm." Bradley rubbed his jaw. He looked past her, out the kitchen window, at the fields running flat and brown to the tree line. "We'll talk about it later," he said. He left an hour after that. Did not help clear the plates. Shook 2 hands on his way to the door and was on his phone before he reached his car. Dorothy stood on the porch and watched the white Escalade turn south at the blacktop and disappear toward Nashville. Linda stayed longer. She washed every dish in the sink without being asked, dried them, and put them back in the wrong cabinets. Dorothy did not correct her. When Linda was ready to leave, she stood in the doorway with her keys in her hand. "You're going to be all right, Mom." "I know. Call me if you need anything." "I will." Linda hugged her. A careful hug. She held on but did not squeeze because she was afraid of what might come loose. Then Linda left. The church people left. The co-op men left. Hank was the last one out the door. He shook Dorothy's hand on the porch and said, "Earl was a good man, Dot. You call me if you need anything. I mean it." Then it was Dorothy in the house and Copper. She sat in Earl's rocking chair on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. Copper lay at her feet, chin on his paws. The evening was quiet except for the frogs in the creek bottom and a barn owl in the oak by the road. She was thinking about the woodpile, whether to finish splitting it or leave the axe where Earl had dropped it. She was thinking about how a house sounds different when there's only one person breathing in it. That was when she heard the diesels. 2 trucks, then a third, coming up the farm road with headlights cutting white lines through the dark. Dorothy set down the coffee and stood. Copper stood beside her, ears forward, a low sound building in his throat. The trucks were big, flatbeds with hydraulic tilts and steel ramps. The first one backed up to the fence on the south side of the driveway. The bed tilted with a groan. Something slid off the back and hit the dirt with a sound like a wreck. Metal on rock. The ground shook under Dorothy's feet. The second truck dumped its load 10 yards down the fence. Then the third. Dorothy walked off the porch and into the yard. In the headlights, she could see them. Tractors, old ones, rusted through in patches, listing where the tires had gone flat or rotted off the rims. One had no seat. Another had weeds growing up through the engine compartment. A third was missing both rear wheels and sat tilted in the dirt. 6 of them. Lined up along her fence, a young man climbed out of the first truck. Maybe 25 ball caps, steel-toed boots. He would not look her in the eye. "Ma'am, I have paperwork says these belong on this property. Storage fees owed to Deeks Salvage. Mr. Deeks says your husband agreed to take delivery. My husband died 4 days ago." The young man shifted his weight. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am, but the paperwork is signed." He held out a manila folder. Dorothy took it. The young man climbed back into his truck, and all 3 flatbeds pulled down the farm road. Their taillights shrank to red dots at the county blacktop, and then they were gone. Dorothy stood in the yard holding the folder. Copper walked to the nearest tractor, sniffed the axle, and sneezed. She opened the folder under the porch light. Storage transfer agreement. 6 units itemized. A signature line at the bottom, dated 3 weeks before Earl died. The signature was not Earl's. Dorothy had been reading Earl's handwriting since before Bradley was born. Grocery lists, birthday cards, parts numbers scrawled in the margins of equipment catalogs. She knew what his name looked like when he wrote it. This was Bradley's signature. She closed the folder, went inside, sat on the couch in the dark with the folder on her lap and Copper on the floor beside her, and she did not move for a long time. Earl's reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His boots were by the back door. His coffee mug sat in the dish rack, washed and dried, waiting for a morning that would not come. Around 2 a.m, she said out loud to nobody, "Your daddy spent 46 years pretending he didn't need help. I spent 46 years pretending I didn't know how to give it." Copper lifted his head. "Go back to sleep," she told him. He did. She did not. Dawn came slow and gray. Dorothy got up, made coffee, put on an old flannel shirt, and a pair of Earl's work jeans cinched with a belt she had punched 2 extra holes into. She went out the back door into a morning that smelled like wet iron and cold grass. The 6 tractors were still there. In daylight, they looked worse. Paint flaking to bare metal. Flat tires splitting at the sidewalls. Bird droppings on the hoods. But Dorothy was not looking at the damage. She was looking at the third one from the left. Green under the rust. John Deere green. A 40-20. Her father had driven a 40-20 on his place in Grady County when she was 7. He used to let her sit on his lap while he plowed. She remembered the vibration of the seat, the smell of diesel and turned earth, the steering wheel so wide his arms barely reached. When that tractor quit for good, her father parked it under an elm tree and her mother put a planter box on the hood. That was the end of it. But Dorothy had always wondered what was wrong with it. She had always wanted to open the hood and find out. She walked to the 40-20 now, put her hand on the hood, cold metal rough with rust under her palm. She lifted it. The engine was filthy, caked in dirt and oil and weather. But the block was not cracked. The cylinders were not seized. She could see where the fuel line had corroded and where the starter solenoid had rusted solid, but the bones were there. Solid iron, built to last. "This one has good bones," she said to Copper, who had followed her across the yard. He thumped his tail once in the dirt. She stood looking at that engine for a long time with her coffee cooling in her hand. Then she went inside, opened the junk drawer, the one that stuck on the left side and had to be lifted to pull free. Behind the rubber bands and dead batteries and twist ties, there was a rolled canvas pouch she had not touched in a long time. She unrolled it on the counter, 12 metric wrenches, chrome vanadium, arranged by size. She had bought them at a hardware store the year she turned 22, the semester she took night classes at the community college before she married Earl, and put the wrenches in the drawer and never told anyone why she owned them. She picked up the 10mm, felt the weight of it, put the pouch in her back pocket, walked outside, set her coffee on the fence post, and climbed up onto the 40-20's front tire to reach the engine. She started with the fuel system. That was what you checked first if you wanted to know whether an engine was worth saving. She disconnected the fuel line, drained what was left into a bucket. It came out black and thick and smelled like varnish. The fuel filter was clogged solid. packed with sediment that had turned to paste. She cleaned the old filter with diesel from the drum Earl kept in the equipment barn and threaded it back in. It would not last long, but it would tell her what she needed to know about the rest of the engine. The starter would not engage. She traced the wiring from the key switch through the harness to the solenoid, found the corrosion, cleaned 2 terminals with a wire brush from Earl's workbench, tried the key. Click. Half a second of catch, then nothing. Not enough current. She pulled the battery, carried it to the equipment barn, and set it on Earl's trickle charger. 6 hours minimum, maybe 8 for a battery that had been sitting dead in a field. While it charged, she went back to the 4020 and moved to the air intake. The filter housing was packed with mouse nests and dead leaves and things she did not look at too closely. She cleaned it by hand, checked the carburetor throat for debris, and ran her finger along the manifold gasket. Cracked in 2 places but not blown through. She marked them with a grease pencil. She checked the timing by feel, set the valve lash by ear, adjusted the idle mixture a quarter turn rich because a cold engine that has been sitting needs the extra fuel on first start. 3 hours went by before she realized she had not eaten. Her flannel was dark with grease down the front. Her hands were black to the wrists. A smear of oil ran across her forehead where she had pushed her hair back. She did not go inside. Around noon, a truck pulled into the driveway, boots on gravel. She pulled her head out from under the hood. Hank Jessup stood in the yard in his overalls and a green ball cap, holding a thermos and a paper bag. Hank drove past this morning and saw the iron. He looked at the row of tractors along the fence, then at Dorothy at her hands and the wrenches on the fender. Drove past again just now and saw you under the hood. He set the thermos on the fender and poured her a cup, pulled a ham sandwich from the paper bag and put it next to the wrenches. "Eat that," he said, "then show me what you've done." Dorothy ate standing up, leaning against the front tire. Hank walked around the 4020 while she ate. He checked the fuel line she had rebuilt. He looked at the wiring she had cleaned and the connection she had cleaned and the connection she had reseated. He bent and studied the manifold where she had marked the cracks. He straightened up and took off his cap. "Earl teach you all this." Dorothy wiped her hands on the flannel. "Earl taught me some of it." Hank looked at her a long moment. He had been farming for half a century, and he knew what good mechanical work looked like. What he saw on this tractor was more than some of it. But he was also a man who knew when not to push a question. He put his cap back on, went to his truck, and came back carrying a red toolbox in one hand and a trouble light in the other. "All right, Dot," he said. "Show me what needs doing." They worked side by side into the evening. The shadows of the 6 tractors stretched long across the grass. Copper lay in a patch of warm dirt between the 2nd and 3rd tractor and watched them, his tail twitching whenever one of them spoke, which was not often. They were 2 people who understood that good work did not need much talking. When the lights started to go, Dorothy stepped back from the engine and wiped her hands. The fuel system was rebuilt. The wiring was clean. The starter was freed. The battery was still on the charger in the barn, storing current. Hank packed his toolbox. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "I want you to," Dorothy said. He tipped his cap and drove off. Dorothy stood alone in the yard with Copper beside her. 6 tractors along the fence. 1 almost ready, 5 still waiting. In the equipment barn, the battery charger ticked. Hank's truck pulled into the driveway at 7 the next morning. Dorothy was already in the equipment barn, standing over the battery charger. The light had turned green sometime in the night. She disconnected the leads, carried the battery across the yard, and set it into the 4020's tray. Tightened the terminals. Positive first, then negative. Her hands were steady. Hank leaned against the fender with his arms folded. "You want to do the honors? It's your wrench that cleaned that fuel line," Dorothy said. "My wrench. Your hands." Dorothy climbed into the seat. The vinyl was cracked and the foam showed through, but it held her weight. She put her foot on the clutch and turned the key. The starter whined. The engine coughed once, caught, sputtered. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stack. Dorothy gave it a quarter pump on the throttle and the engine caught again, rough and shaking the whole frame. She held steady and listened. The knocking smoothed. The RPMs climbed. The black smoke thinned to gray and then to nothing. The 4020 was running. The sound carried across the field, a deep, steady diesel rumble that Dorothy felt through the seat and the steering column and the iron frame under her, the same vibration she remembered from her father's lap when she was 7. Copper lifted his head from the grass and his ears came forward. Hank took off his cap and held it against his chest. "That is the prettiest sound I have heard in a long time," he said. Dorothy let the engine run for 10 minutes. The manifold gasket needed replacing before she could push it hard, and the oil was long past due for a change. But it ran. That was what mattered. 1 down, Hank said. 5 to go. She shut it off, climbed down, and walked to the second tractor in the row, a Massey Ferguson. Smaller than the Deere, red paint faded to the color of old brick. She lifted the hood and leaned in. The engine looked the same as the first, dirty, rusted. But something was different. She reached in and felt the top of the block where the hydraulic pump should have been. Clean metal, empty bolt holes, no broken flange, no sheared bolts, no corrosion at the opening. Someone had removed that pump with a socket wrench, recently enough that the exposed surface had not yet started to rust. She straightened up. Hank, come look at this. He walked around and looked where she was pointing. He touched the clean bolt holes with his finger. That is not broken, he said. No, somebody took it off. They looked at each other. Dorothy walked to the third tractor. A Ford, lifted the hood. The alternator was gone. Same story. Mounting bracket empty. Bolts backed out clean. Wiring harness tucked to the side. Fourth tractor, an older Deere. PTO shaft missing from the rear. Not snapped off. Unbolted. Fifth, a case. Starter motor and voltage regulator both gone. Pulled clean. Sixth, the International Harvester, biggest of the lot. The fuel injection pump had been removed from the engine block. 8 bolts, every one extracted without stripping. Dorothy stood in the middle of the row. 6 tractors, 6 different components missing. Everyone removed by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. None of this is random, she said. Hank shook his head. Somebody harvested these machines. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about Earl, about the broken tractors he had been bringing home for as long as she could remember. Once or twice a year, he would come back from an auction and tell her he had picked up another wreck for $50 or $100. Scrap it for parts, he said. A little pocket money. But she never saw the pocket money. The tractors would sit behind the equipment barn for a few weeks and then they would be gone. She asked once where they went. Earl said the dump. She had believed him. There was no reason not to. Now she stood in front of 6 machines that somebody had taken apart with surgical precision, and she was not sure she believed him anymore. Earl was buying these, she said. Broken tractors. He was bringing them home for a long time. Hank nodded slowly. I know. He asked me once if I had any old equipment I wanted rid of. I gave him a hay rake and a set of plow discs. He was pleased about it. Loaded them up himself. Did he tell you what he did with them? Said he was scrapping them. Did you believe that? Hank looked across the property at the big barn with the padlocked doors. The brass lock caught the morning light. I never pushed him on it, Hank said. Earl was a private man. Yes, he was, Dorothy thought. A private man who spent his evenings behind a padlock doing something he never once mentioned to his wife. She did not tell Hank the rest. The community college, the semester of night classes in diesel mechanics, the instructor who told her she had the best diagnostic instinct he had seen in all his semesters of teaching. She kept that to herself, same as she kept quiet about Earl's hands. How the arthritis crept in until he could not grip a wrench, how she would come into the shop after he closed up and finish whatever job he had left half done. Retort the bolts his fingers could not tighten. Replace the gaskets he could not seat. The customers never knew. Earl never spoke of it, and Dorothy never asked him to. It was their arrangement, unspoken and unbroken. What she had learned in that classroom, and what she picked up in that shop over all those quiet evenings, she carried without showing. She could hear what was wrong with a motor the way a good doctor can hear a murmur through a stethoscope. She had kept it quiet because Earl was proud and she loved him, and because in the county she grew up in, a woman who could rebuild a transmission drew puzzlement before it drew praise. So she kept it in the drawer with the wrenches. The wrenches were out now. I am going to get these running, she told Hank. All 6 of them. You will need the missing parts. I will find them. Bradley called that afternoon. Dorothy was under the hood of the Massey Ferguson, cleaning and testing everything she could reach around the absent pump, getting the tractor ready for the day she found a replacement. The phone rang in the kitchen. She wiped her hands on a rag and went inside. Mom, I just heard from the county assessor. Someone filed a complaint about the equipment on your property. Code violation. You have got 30 days to clear it or they start condemnation proceedings. Someone filed a complaint. That is what they told me. And they called you about my property. Silence on the line. Bradley, you arranged those tractors and you filed that complaint. What I did or did not do does not change the 30 days, Mom. Just sell. Take the money. Move near me in Nashville or near Linda in Knoxville, wherever you want. Stop making this harder than it has to be. Somebody dumped 6 pieces of iron on my land the evening of your father's funeral, and now the county is threatening my home. I am not the one making this hard. I am trying to help you. Goodbye, Bradley." She hung up, stood at the kitchen window a full minute looking at the tractors along the fence. Then she went back outside and got under the hood. She worked through the afternoon. Hank left around 4 with a promise to come back the next morning. Dorothy kept going. She was tracing a wiring fault on the Ford, following a corroded harness from the fuse box to the starter relay, when she heard Copper, not barking, scratching. She pulled her head out from under the hood and looked. He was at the big barn, the one at the far end of the property, the one Earl had always kept locked. Copper was standing at the double doors with his front paws working at the gap between the door and the ground, his nose pressed into the crack where the 2 doors met, not idle scratching. Deliberate braced his shoulders into it. "Copper, come here." He ignored her, kept scratching. And his tail was moving. Not wagging exactly, but swaying. Low and steady, back and forth. Dorothy had not seen his tail move since the day she found Earl in the side yard. She set down the wrench, walked across the property to the barn. Copper saw her coming and whined. A real whine, high and urgent. She stood in front of the doors. She had not been inside this barn since she could not remember when. Earl kept it padlocked, and she had never questioned that because he was a man who needed his own space, and she was a woman who understood that about him. But Earl was gone. And 6 tractors had been stripped by somebody who knew their way around an engine, and the parts were not at any scrapyard. And Copper had not stopped scratching at this door since the funeral. She reached into the pocket of her apron, Earl's keyring. The hospital had given it to her along with his wallet and his watch and the reading glasses he had been wearing when they loaded him into the ambulance, house key, truck key, shop key, and a 4th key she had never used, small, brass, the teeth worn down smooth from turning. She held it up next to the padlock. Same brass, same age. Copper whined again. Dorothy put the key in the lock. It slid in smooth. She turned it and the hasp clicked open. She pulled the padlock off and set it in the dirt, grabbed the right side door handle with both hands and pulled. The hinges were stiff, but they moved. The door swung wide and afternoon light fell into the barn in a long, bright wedge across the floor. Dorothy stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and Copper pressing warm against her leg, and she looked inside. It was not junk. The first thing Dorothy saw was a workbench. It ran the full back wall of the barn, 8 feet of pine planking sanded smooth and sealed with polyurethane. Tools hung above it on a pegboard, each one outlined in black marker so you knew exactly where it went back. To the left, 3 welding stations built from tractor frames, cut and re-welded and bolted to the concrete floor. Each one had its own ventilation hood running up through the roof. Along the right wall, a parts rack, floor to ceiling, 40 bins deep, every bin labeled in Earl's square handwriting by make and model, JD fuel system, MF hydraulic, Case electrical, IH injection. In the center of the floor, a compressed air system rigged from a truck compressor mounted on a steel platform, pneumatic lines running to each station, a pressure gauge, an oil trap, and at the back, near the workbench, a teaching area. 6 folding chairs in a half circle facing a chalkboard on the wall. The chalkboard was not blank. In Earl's handwriting in white chalk it read, Basic desaltilage Gnostics fuel, check filter, line, pressure, air, check filter, intake, manifold, spark, check plugs, timing, distributor, compression, check gaskets, rings, valves. Below that in smaller letters, Dorothy will know what to do. She stood at the chalkboard a long time reading those 6 words. Then she walked to the workbench. The missing parts were there, all of them. Each one mounted on a wooden stand at working height, the hydraulic pump from the Massey Ferguson installed in a cutaway display with the housing opened, so you could see the gears inside. The alternator from the Ford wired into a test rig with a voltmeter and a set of alligator clips. The PTO shaft from the older Deere connected to a small grinding wheel through a reduction gearbox. The starter motor from the case, mounted on a demonstration board with the solenoid exposed. And the fuel injection pump from the International Harvester, mounted on a steel plate with each component labeled in Earl's hand. The governor, the metering valve, the delivery valve, a note pinned to the plate, hardest part on any diesel. Get this right, and the rest is easy. Earl had not scrapped these parts. He had turned them into teaching tools. Every component missing from the 6 tractors in Dorothy's yard was here in this barn, doing exactly what Earl had built this place to do, teaching people how machines work. Copper walked through the space ahead of her, nose to the floor, tail swaying. He knew this place. He had been here with Earl, Dorothy realized, lying on the floor while Earl worked, night after night. That was why he had been scratching at the door. She found the first note in a coffee can by the welding station, a receipt from the feed store, and on the back in pencil, "This county is losing its farmers because nobody can afford a mechanic." The second was in the toolbox drawer under the workbench. A church bulletin from a Sunday 2 springs ago. "Almost done, maybe next spring." The third was on a scrap of envelope taped to the compressed air gauge. "If the pressure drops below 90 psi, check the oil trap first." Changed the seals in March. The fourth was folded inside the cap of a paint can on the shelf. "For the county, for Dot." Not done yet, but close. Each note was small, practical, written in the quick, square hand of a man who said little and meant all of it. They were not love letters. They were not poems. They were the thoughts of a man who had been working alone for a long time and needed somewhere to put what he was thinking. Dorothy carried the coffee can to the teaching area and sat down in one of the folding chairs. She held the receipt in both hands and read it again. "This county is losing its farmers because nobody can afford a mechanic." She remembered now. The summer after they married, they were sitting on the porch watching the fields turn dark. Earl was quiet, which was normal, but there was a weight to it that evening. "My daddy lost this farm because of a combine," he said. "Busted fuel pump. Dealer wanted $800 to fix it. Daddy did not have $800, so the combine sat all harvest. Lost the crop, lost the loan, lost the land, all of it over one fuel pump." Dorothy waited. She could tell he was not finished. $800, Earl said. "I could have fixed that pump in an afternoon if I had the tools and somebody to show me how. That is all it would have took." "Then build a place where people can learn," Dorothy said. Earl looked at her. "Maybe someday," he said. She did not know it then, but Earl had heard her, and somewhere in the years after their youngest left for college, quietly, without telling anyone, he started building. Evenings and weekends, buying broken tractors not for scrap but for parts, carrying them into this barn piece by piece, bolting together the workshop that would teach a county how to keep its own machines alive. He built it alone. He never said a word, maybe because he wanted it finished first, maybe because he was afraid she would tell him it was too much, maybe because Earl Harding was the kind of man who showed you what he meant instead of talking about it. 2 decades of work, and he had run out of time, one fuel pump short of done. Dorothy sat in the folding chair holding the receipt, and she did not cry. She put her other hand on the edge of the workbench and felt the wood that Earl's hands had worn smooth night after night for longer than some of her children had lived at home. Copper walked over and put his chin on her knee. She scratched behind his ears and he closed his eyes. "You knew about all of this," she said. His tail thumped once on the dirt floor. If you have made it this far into Dorothy's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Dorothy stood up, wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, looked around the barn one more time at the afternoon light coming through the doors. The workshop was close to finished. The welding stations worked. The compressor was running. The parts rack was stocked. What remained was detail work. The electrical panel needed a few more circuits wired. 2 ventilation hoods were not connected to the roof vents. A section of shelving needed reinforcing where the weight of the bins had started to bow the boards. She could do this. She had the hands and the knowledge and the reason. But she had a problem. The missing tractor parts, the ones that Bradley's scheme had dropped in her yard, and the county was now threatening to condemn her for those parts were installed in Earl's workshop. The hydraulic pump powered the welding clamps. The alternator ran the test bench. The PTO shaft drove the grinder. Every missing part served a purpose here. If she pulled them out to rebuild the tractors, she would gut the workshop. If she left them in, she would lose the farm. Dorothy thought about it for exactly as long as it took to walk from the teaching area to the workbench and back. Then she went to the kitchen and started making phone calls. The parts store in town had a hydraulic pump that would fit the Massey Ferguson. $80, used, no warranty. She told them to hold it. A salvage yard 2 counties over had an alternator for the Ford and a starter motor for the Case. Ready by Thursday. Hank picked up on the second ring. She told him what she had found in the barn. He was quiet for a long time. "I will be damned," he said. "Do you still have that PTO shaft from your father's old deer?" "I believe I do. In the back of my shed, been there since I do not know when. Can I have it? I will bring it in the morning." That left 2 parts she could not source locally. The voltage regulator for the Case, which she could work around with a bypass circuit, and the fuel injection pump for the International Harvester. The AH pump was the hard one. You did not find that at a county parts store. She would need to widen the search. She would need some luck. But 5 tractors could be running within the week, and while she looked for the 6th part, she could finish the workshop. She started the next morning. Hank arrived at 7 with the PTO shaft in his truck bed, and an expression Dorothy had not seen on him before. He walked through the barn slowly. He touched the welding stations. He read the labels on the parts bins. He stood at the chalkboard for a long time. He never said a word, Hank said. No. All those tractors he was buying. All those evenings out here. Yes. Hank read the line at the bottom of the chalkboard. Dorothy will know what to do. He took off his cap and put it back on and was quiet for a while. Then he picked up a wrench and they went to work. Dorothy split her days. Mornings on the tractors, rebuilding them with the replacement parts as they arrived. Afternoons in the barn, finishing what Earl had started. She wired the electrical panel, connected the vent hoods, reinforced the shelving, cleaned every bin on the parts rack, checking Earl's labels against what was inside and correcting the ones he had misfiled, which were few. The 4020 was already running. By the end of the first week, the Massey Ferguson was running with its new pump, and the Ford with the salvage alternator. 3 tractors in a row along the driveway, engines tested, fluids changed, tires aired. Not pretty, but alive. By the end of the second week, the workshop was done. What happened next, she did not plan. It just happened. A man she had never met pulled into the driveway on a Wednesday afternoon. He drove a pickup with a stock trailer, and he had a look on his face that Dorothy recognized. The look of a man whose equipment had broken and who could not afford the fix. "Ma'am, I am sorry to bother you. I run a dairy operation 6 miles north. My bulk tank compressor went out, and the dealer wants $1,400 to replace the unit. Hank Jessup said you might take a look." Dorothy wiped her hands. "Where is it?" "In the truck." She walked to the bed of his pickup. He had the compressor wrapped in a moving blanket. She pulled the blanket off, felt the housing, checked the motor leads, smelled the coil. "Burnt winding on the start capacitor," she said. "Compressor is fine. The capacitor is a $12 part." The man stared at her. $1,400, and it is a $12 part. The dealer would replace the whole unit. They do not rebuild capacitors. I can fix this in less than an hour if you have the part, or I can rig a bypass that will hold you until you get one. He had the part in 40 minutes. Dorothy had the compressor running in another 20. He reached for his wallet. Dorothy shook her head. "Come back when the barn is ready," she said. "Bring your tools." He looked at the barn, looked at the tractors, looked at Dorothy. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He drove away. 15 minutes later, another truck turned up the farm road. Dorothy watched it come. She picked up her wrench and walked out to meet it. By the third week, Dorothy had stopped counting the trucks that came up the farm road. 5 of the 6 tractors were running. They sat in a row along the driveway, engines tested, fluids topped off, tires filled, the 4020, the Massey Ferguson, the Ford, the older Deere, the Case. They were not showpieces. The paint was still rough and the seats were still cracked. But every one of them started on the first turn of the key. The workshop was finished. Dorothy had added things Earl never got to. A first aid kit by the door, a fire extinguisher at each welding station, a whiteboard beside the chalkboard where she wrote the schedule for anyone who was coming that week to work on their equipment. Farmers were showing up regularly now. Not every day, but often enough that Dorothy kept the barn doors open and the coffee pot plugged in. The dairyman came back with his tools and fixed a neighbor's milking pump while Dorothy watched. The teenager Danny came 3 days a week after school to learn. A woman who ran a landscaping crew spent an entire Saturday afternoon rebuilding a string trimmer engine and left with grease on her face and a grin she could not get rid of. The only tractor still dead was the International Harvester. Dorothy had called every salvage yard and parts dealer within 100 miles. Nobody carried an IJ fuel injection pump for that model. The part sat in the barn on Earl's demonstration stand, labeled and displayed and useless in a running tractor. She was under the hood of the Massey Ferguson, adjusting the idle when she heard vehicles on the farm road. 3 of them. She straightened up and looked. Bradley's white Escalade was in front. Behind it, a county truck with a seal on the door. Behind that, a silver sedan she did not recognize. Bradley got out first. Slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a man in a polo shirt climbed out of the sedan carrying a leather portfolio. The county truck produced a man in a gray uniform with a clipboard. "Mom," Bradley said, "this is Mr. Dwyer from Building Safety. He needs to inspect the structures." "And who is that?" Dorothy nodded at the man with the portfolio. Bradley did not answer. "Ma'am, I need to look at any structure being used for public or commercial activity," the inspector said. "Standard walkthrough." "There is no commercial activity on this property," Dorothy said. "I help my neighbors. Nobody pays." "I understand, ma'am. I still need to look." Then come look. She led him to the barn. He stepped inside and paused. The same pause Dorothy had felt 3 weeks earlier. Then he started moving through the space with his clipboard. He checked the welding stations. These vented to the outside? Yes. 4-inch duct through the roof at each station. Who did the duct work? My husband built the stations. I connected the venting. He checked the electrical panel, opened the cover and studied the breakers. Who wired this? I did. You have a panel schedule. Dorothy pointed to the typed label on the inside of the panel door. Every circuit mapped, every breaker labeled. She had done it the way she learned it. The inspector checked the compressed air system. Read the rating on the compressor, tested the shutoff valves at each station, looked at the pneumatic lines and their joints. He walked the parts rack, pulled on the top shelf. It did not move. He spent 15 minutes in the barn, checked the fire extinguisher, the first aid kit, the clearances around the welding stations, the floor drainage. When he was done, he came back to Dorothy near the entrance. Ma'am, this is as solid a shop as I have seen in this county. Venting is to code. Electrical is clean. Your fire safety is better than most commercial operations I inspect. He signed his clipboard. If you ever go commercial, you would pass as. The inspector shook her hand and went back to his truck. The man with the portfolio stood in the driveway looking at the 6 tractors, making notes. He had not spoken to Dorothy, and she had not spoken to him. Bradley walked over to her. Can we talk? We can. They walked to the side of the barn. Bradley kept his voice low. You cannot keep doing this, Mom. You need permits. You need insurance. You need a zoning variance. What happens if somebody gets hurt in there? Nobody is going to get hurt. The inspector just said it is up to code. That is not what I mean. I mean what happens when somebody sues you. What happens when somebody drops a tractor on their foot and their lawyer finds out you have 0 liability coverage. I am not running a business, Bradley. I am finishing what your father started. Dad was a broke farmer who could not keep the roof patched. Dorothy looked at her son. Then she turned and walked into the barn. Bradley followed. She went to the workbench and picked up the coffee can with Earl's notes. She held it out. Read those. Bradley took the can. He pulled out the receipts and scraps one at a time, unfolding them, reading Earl's handwriting. The one about the county losing its farmers. The one about the county losing its farmers. The one that said Dorothy will know what to do. His expression shifted while he read. The set of his jaw loosened, then tightened, then went still. This does not change anything, Mom. It changes everything. You cannot live out here alone running a barn full of strangers and broken equipment. I am not alone. Not anymore. He put the notes back in the can, handed it to her, walked to his car without saying goodbye. The man with the portfolio followed. They pulled out of the driveway and were gone. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Bradley had filed a petition for conservatorship with the county court. The filing stated that Dorothy Harding, age 68, was unable to manage her property or make sound financial decisions. A hearing was scheduled 4 weeks out. Dorothy read it at the kitchen table. Read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the junk drawer, next to the wrenches. Linda called that evening. Mom, he filed papers. He is trying to have you declared incompetent. I know. I got the letter. Are you okay? I am fine, Linda. Come see for yourself when you are ready. Linda came that Saturday. She pulled into the driveway at noon and sat in her car for a full minute, both hands on the wheel, before she got out. She was expecting to find her mother in trouble. What she found was Dorothy in the barn, standing at the workbench showing Danny how to rebuild the carburetor. Copper was on his horse blanket in the corner. 2 farmers were at the welding station repairing a grain auger. The coffee was on. A radio was playing low. Linda stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. Dorothy saw her. Linda, hand me that flathead screwdriver. Linda looked at the workbench, found the screwdriver, handed it over. Good. Now hold this float bowl while I show Danny how the needle valve seats. Linda held the bowl. Danny leaned in. Dorothy talked them both through it, step by step, in the same voice she had used to teach her children how to make scrambled eggs. After Danny left on his bicycle, Linda walked through the barn alone. She read the chalkboard. She read the labels on the parts bins. She found the coffee can and read every note inside it, standing in the middle of the shop with the receipts in her hands. She sat down on the 5-gallon bucket by the workbench and put her face in her hands. He was building this the whole time, she said. Yes, and nobody knew. Copper knew. Copper thumped his tail once from the blanket without lifting his head. Linda wiped her eyes. Why didn't he tell us? Because your father was not a man who talked about what he was going to do. He was a man who did it and let you see it after. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea and the court letter between them. What are you going to do about Bradley? Linda asked. Dorothy wrapped her hands around the mug. Your brother is scared. He has been scared since he was a boy. Scared of being poor. Scared of this land. Scared of ending up like your father, out here with calloused hands and nothing in the bank. He left home at 18, and he has been running from this place ever since. That does not give him the right to take your home. No, it does not, and I will not let him tear down what Earl built, but I am not going to hate him for being afraid. Linda looked at her mother across the table. What do you need from me? Stay the weekend. Help me in the barn. I've got one more tractor to finish and I could use a second set of hands. Which one? The big international harvester. What does it need? A fuel injection pump, and I cannot find one anywhere. Linda frowned. What about the one in the barn? On the display stand. Dorothy had been thinking about this for 2 weeks. Earl's pump, the one he had mounted and labeled and written his teaching notes around, the centerpiece of his lesson on diesel injection systems. She could pull it. It would fit, but it would leave a gap in what Earl had built. She had spent 3 weeks protecting the workshop, replacing parts with her own so Earl's work stayed whole. This was different. There was no replacement pump. Earl would not have wanted that pump on a display stand while the county tears down his barn, Dorothy said. Linda was quiet. He built this place so people could learn to fix things, not so things could sit on a shelf looking nice. I can teach injection systems myself. I do not need a display piece for that. The next morning, they pulled the pump. Dorothy removed it from the stand with care, labeling each connection, wrapping the housing in a clean shop towel. She carried it across the yard and set it on the International Harvester's engine block. Linda handed her the bolts. It took most of the day. The pump had to be timed to the engine. Fuel lines bled. Governor adjusted. Throttle linkage set. Dorothy worked with steady hands and Linda stayed beside her, holding lights, passing tools, asking questions that Dorothy answered without looking up from the engine. By late afternoon, it was done. Pump installed. Lines bled. Governor set. Throttle tested. Dorothy climbed into the seat of the International Harvester. It was the biggest tractor in the row, tall and wide, and the seat put her high enough to see over the barn roof to the tree line beyond. Hank had arrived an hour earlier to watch. He stood by the front wheel with his cap in his hands. Linda stood beside him. Copper had walked over from the barn and was sitting in the grass, ears up. Ready, Dorothy said. Ready, Linda said. Dorothy put her foot on the clutch and reached for the key. She turned the key. The starter ground. The engine coughed, caught, missed, caught again. Black smoke rolled from the exhaust stack. Dorothy held the throttle steady and waited. The knocking smoothed, the RPMs climbed. The smoke thinned and cleared. The International Harvester was running. 6 for 6. Dorothy sat in the seat with her hands on the wheel and let the engine settle. The eye had a different voice than the 4020. Deeper. Rougher. A big engine that had been resting a long time and was finding its rhythm again. Hank stood by the front wheel with his cap against his chest, the same way he had stood when the 4020 came to life. Linda was beside him with her hand over her mouth. Copper sat in the grass with his ears forward. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Hank said, Earl would have liked that sound. Dorothy shut the engine off, climbed down, wiped her hands on the rag from her back pocket. All right, she said. Now we open the barn. She did not plan an event. She did not make phone calls or hang flyers or post anything anywhere. On Saturday morning, she and Linda opened the barn doors at 7, turned on the lights and the compressor in the coffee pot, and Dorothy painted a sign on a scrap of plywood with a brush and a can of White House paint. She carried it to the end of the driveway and nailed it to the fence post. Harding Farm Equipment Workshop. Bring your tools. Bring your problems. Coffee is on. By 9, there were 4 trucks in the yard. By noon, there were 14. They came in pickups and flatbeds, and one woman in a minivan with a chainsaw in the back seat. Farmers who had heard from Hank or from the dairyman or from Danny, who had told everyone at school. They brought broken mowers and seized generators, and a hay baler with a slipping clutch and a brush hog that would not engage, and a stock tank heater with a shorted element and everything else that had been sitting in their sheds waiting for a repair they could not afford. Dorothy moved between the stations. She spent 20 minutes at the welding table helping a man repair a cracked plow blade. She walked a woman through a carburetor rebuild on a push mower. She diagnosed a wiring fault on an ATV by listening to the starter for 3 seconds, and the man who owned it just stared at her. How did you know that? He asked. Practice, she said, and moved to the next station. Hank had set up a table by the barn entrance with 2 thermoses and a plate of oatmeal cookies his neighbor had made. He talked to everyone who walked in because Hank was a man who made strangers feel welcome without trying. Linda was at the workbench, putting tools back in their outlined spots on the pegboard. She had memorized the layout in 2 days, and she kept it organized with the same steady attention she used to manage her classroom. Danny was at the far end of the barn with a mower engine he had rebuilt on his own. He had it on the workbench, and he was showing a younger kid how the governor assembly worked, pointing to the linkage with a screwdriver, explaining it the way Dorothy had explained it to him. Step by step, plain words, no shortcuts. Dorothy watched him for a moment, then she turned back to the woman with the brush hog. The afternoon moved on. People came and went. Some fixed their equipment and left. Others stayed to help someone else. A man who had come to repair his generator ended up showing another farmer how to weld a bracket. 2 women who had never met before spent an hour together diagnosing a fuel problem on a riding mower. And when they figured it out, they shook hands and laughed, and one of them said she would bring pie next Saturday. The barn was full of noise, wrenches on bolts, the hiss of the compressor, the pop and crackle of the welding station, somebody's radio playing quietly in the corner, and underneath all of it, the steady sound of people talking to each other about things that mattered to them, which is the sound a community makes when it is working the way it should. It was mid-afternoon when the white Escalade pulled into the driveway. Dorothy saw it through the barn doors. She set down the wrench she was holding and wiped her hands on the rag. Linda saw it too. She walked to Dorothy's side. "I can tell him to leave," Linda said. "No, let him come." Bradley got out of the car. He was wearing dress pants and a white shirt, no tie. He had a manila folder in his hand. Dorothy could see the edge of the court seal on the top page, the conservatorship papers. He walked across the yard toward the barn. As he passed the 6 tractors parked in a row along the driveway, he slowed down. He looked at them. They were not the same machines that had been dumped along the fence 6 weeks ago. The rust was gone. The paint was rough in places, still showing where the primer had not fully covered, but each tractor had been repainted in its original color. Green for the Dearies, red for the Massey Ferguson, blue for the Ford, red and white for the Case, red for the International Harvester. On the 4020, the first tractor in the row, there was a small brass plate bolted to the fender. Dorothy had made it from a piece of scrap brass she found in the workshop, stamped the letters with a nail set and a hammer. Earl Harding Memorial Workshop. Below that, 2 dates. The year Earl started building, and the year Dorothy finished. Bradley stopped in front of it. He read the first date. He read it again. Then he stood very still. He knew that year. He was 18 that year. It was the year he packed his things into his car and drove to Nashville and told his father that there was nothing on this land worth staying for, that farming was dying, that the smart move was to sell and get out while the getting was good. His father had nodded, had not argued, had shaken Bradley's hand in the driveway and watched him drive away. And then Earl Harding had walked to the barn and started building. Bradley stood in front of the brass plate for a long time. The folder hung at his side. Then he walked into the barn. He stopped just inside the doors. The space was full. 15, maybe 20 people working and talking. The smell of coffee and welding flux and old iron, wrenches ringing on metal, the compressor running. Someone laughing at the welding station. It was not a memorial. It was not a museum. It was a working shop, alive and doing exactly what it had been built to do. Bradley walked through it slowly. He looked at the welding stations his father had built from tractor frames. He looked at the parts wall his father had labeled in that square handwriting Bradley had not seen in years. He looked at the teaching area where Danny was showing a younger kid how a governor worked. He stopped at the chalkboard, read the lesson on diesel diagnostics. Read the line at the bottom. Dorothy will know what to do. He found Dorothy at the workbench. She was helping a woman trace a short in a stock tank heater, a multimeter in one hand and a wiring diagram she had drawn on a napkin in the other. Dorothy looked up. Bradley held out the folder. Dorothy set down the multimeter. She looked at the papers. She looked at her son. She did not reach for them. Bradley looked at the folder in his hand, looked around the barn, at the people, at the stations, at the light coming through the open doors and falling across the floor his father had poured 20 years ago. He folded the papers in half and put them in his back pocket. "I do not understand why he did not just tell me," Bradley said. His voice was quieter than Dorothy had heard it since he was a boy. "Because you would have told him it was a bad investment." Bradley closed his eyes. He stood in the middle of the workshop with his hands at his sides, and he did not speak for a long time. Dorothy did not fill the silence. She let it sit. Sometimes that is all you can do for someone who is just beginning to understand what they missed. Then a voice from the welding station called out, "Hey, can somebody hold this flashlight? I cannot see the joint." Bradley opened his eyes. He looked at Dorothy. She looked at him. He took off his jacket and hung it over a sawhorse. He rolled up his sleeves. He walked to the welding station and picked up the flashlight and held it where the man needed it. He did not leave for the rest of the afternoon. He did not say much. He held the flashlight. He carried parts from the rack when someone needed them. He swept the floor around the welding stations without being asked. At one point, a farmer handed him a wrench and asked if he could hold a bolt head steady while the farmer tightened the nut from the other side. And Bradley held it, both hands on the wrench, his white shirt smudged with grease across the forearm, and he did not complain. Nobody knew who he was. They just knew he was helping. The barn emptied slowly as the light went orange through the doors. People loaded their equipment and shook Dorothy's hand and said they would be back. Some of them shook Bradley's hand too, not knowing he was the one who had tried to take this place away. By 7, it was just the 5 of them: Dorothy, Linda, Bradley, Hank, and Copper, who had spent the day on his horse blanket in the corner, watching everything, his tail moving whenever someone bent down to scratch his ears. Hank poured the last of the coffee into paper cups and handed them around. Earl always said this county needed a place like this, Hank said. I just did not know he meant it that way. They stood in a loose circle near the entrance. The evening air was cool through the open doors. Crickets starting up in the field. Linda was the one who said it. What about the papers, Bradley? Bradley reached into his back pocket. He pulled out the folded conservatorship petition. He looked at it, then he tore it in half, and then in half again, and dropped the pieces into the trash can by the door. I am sorry, Mom, he said. Dorothy nodded. I know. I was wrong about this place, about all of it. You were scared. Your father understood that. So do I. Bradley looked at the floor. He started building this the year I left. Yes. Why? Dorothy took a sip of her coffee. Because you leaving proved what he was afraid of, that the next generation was walking away from farming, that people would keep losing their land because they could not afford to fix what broke. He could not stop you from leaving, Bradley, but he could build a place that gave people a reason to stay. Bradley wiped his face with his hand. He looked around the barn one more time. Then he nodded. I will come back next Saturday, he said. Bring work clothes, Dorothy said. He almost smiled. He picked up his jacket from the sawhorse and walked to his car. Linda followed him out. Dorothy heard them talking in the driveway, low voices she could not make out, and then 2 car doors and 2 engines and the sound of tires on gravel fading toward the blacktop. Hank finished his coffee and set the cup on the workbench. Monday. Hank? He tipped his cap and drove off. Then it was Dorothy and Copper. She walked through the barn alone, the way she had walked through it the first time, the day she opened the door and found what Earl had built. But it was different now. The space was warm from a day of work. The tools were out of place on the pegboard, and she straightened them, one by one, putting each wrench and socket and screwdriver back in its outlined spot. She wiped down the workbench, turned off the compressor, unplugged the coffee pot. She stopped at the chalkboard. Read Earl's lesson on diagnostics. Read the 6 words he had written at the bottom. Dorothy will know what to do. She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one word underneath. Done. She set the chalk down. Turned off the overhead lights one at a time. The barn went dark except for the light above the entrance, which Earl had wired to a timer. It would burn until midnight and shut off on its own. She walked to the doors. Copper was waiting on the gravel, patient, his hips stiff but his tail still going. She stepped out and pulled the doors closed, set the brass padlock through the hasp and turned the key, not to keep anyone out, just to keep the place safe until morning. She walked to the house with Copper beside her, matching her pace to his. At the porch she stopped and turned. The 6 tractors sat in a row under the farm security light, red and green and blue in the dark, their fresh paint catching the glow. The barn stood behind them with its doors closed and the entrance light still on. The fields lay quiet and flat beyond, all the way to the tree line. Somewhere down the road an engine was running.